Hello everybody, and welcome to the final science mission in KSP2. Today, we will be headed to Tylo, and for all intents and purposes, this is the last mission you're supposed to do in the KSP2 for Science mission line. So starting things off, we are assembling a single command pod with a small detachable satellite on top of it. Below that, we build the ship systems, which around go the final tanks and engines. These are the deep space coronet engines, which are perfect for Tylo's lack of atmosphere. However, Tylo does have high gravity, which makes it very difficult to land on. So a few choices had to be made with this rocket design. 1, I needed a lot of drop tanks. 2, the final payload needed to be absolutely tiny. And 3, it is almost definitely a one-way mission. Not that bothersome though, since this is the last mission. It's not like we need Valentina to go anywhere after this, as this is the last place we need to go. After the landing and upper altitude stages are set up, I then built a small rover. I can't hop across Tylo's surface like I did on the smaller moons. The gravity is too high. So this will allow for a lot more distance tolerance when I choose a landing site. Valentina can just drive to the marker in style. After the rover was put into place and another tank plus engine were put under it, I added a few features to the craft. Extra antennas, a ladder to prevent Valentina from being unable to get back on board. Then things just kinda became a cycle of tanks, engines, drop tanks, staging, repeat. I need a lot of Delta V to get to and orbitalize around Joule, even more to get an intercept with Tylo's sphere of influence, then orbitalize again, and then I should need even more to actually land on the surface without crashing uncontrollably. So, after the coronets, the next deep space engine we have unlocked is the trumpet engine. I'm going to take a moment to appreciate the deep space methalocks that KSP2 added, because they are really convenient. They kind of feel like a compromise between the old nuclear engines and more powerful methalocks engines from KSP1. They're really useful. To get all of this out of atmosphere, in orbit, and on its way to Joule, it's going to take a lot of power. And whether you're in KSP1 or 2, the Mammoth will always reign supreme in that department. So, the bottom of this ship is just a huge block of Mammoth engines and lots of fuel to provide them, because they love to sip. With everything set up, it was now time to do basic checks. I added a couple of separation solid fuel boosters to make sure that all the stages separate without hitting each other while we're flying. I added a bunch of struts into a bunch of different spots to make sure that the ship doesn't shake, especially early on. And I double-checked the crew list to make sure that Valentina was the only one on board and there were no stowaways. And off we go. Valentina's on her way to Tylo. I had to speed up this footage pretty heavily, especially at the start. This large of a craft made the game very framey. Even on my big machine, it was a lot to ask. We used the same trick we always use, trying to point the ship a little bit to the east in order to use planetary rotation. It'll cut down on cost to orbitalize. As you can see, we dropped a majority of the weight just pushing everything else up. But the Mammoths being the Mammoths, they did their job great, and we got ourselves to fully orbitalize quite easily. We then set our target as Joule, with Tylo, the moon around it, as our long-term target. So a perfect intercept with Joule will cost just a little bit over 1800 meters per second in Delta V. This intercept isn't as ideal, however I had to wait 0 days to use it. This kind of ended up just as a very nice transfer window. So once I had my maneuver node lined up, I then set my SAS to target the marker for the maneuver node. It took a little bit of time to get there, but once we got close enough, I then time warped closer to the maneuver and lined everything up perfectly. Then I burned out the remainder of the Mammoth engines, and we moved on to the Deep Space Methalocks engines. One of the funny quirks about these engines is that when they're over atmosphered planets, they can end up having higher efficiencies at higher altitudes. So if you look at the bottom right corner, you can actually see that my delta V is going up while I'm actually draining my fuel tanks. These burns were very long in person, as I didn't use acceleration over time, as I've found, especially with these longer burns, that sometimes it can't be counted on to work consistently or with good accuracy. I kept on having to check the resource manager, and I do it continually throughout this flight, because the right side doesn't actually tell me when to drop my tanks. And if I don't drop the tanks as soon as they empty, I end up with inefficiencies. So halfway on our trip to Jool, while we were still around the main star's sphere of influence, we did a bunch of data checks, because it turns out that I never actually did the research out at that point. So it made sense just to get a little bit of extra research and then transmit it all back, because this ship is not going to be returning back to KSC, ever. So then once we get into Jool's sphere of influence, we do our basic science, and then we set up our braking maneuver burn. We're trying to get ourselves closer to Tylo, but it didn't end up working very well at this altitude, so I ended up just going with a basic braking burn. So as I tried to set up for my Tylo intercept and get into Tylo's sphere of influence so I could brake around it instead, I ran into, I don't know whether it's a bug or user error here, but a lot of the time I would get exceptionally close to Tylo, like definitely within its sphere of influence distance, and it would not detect an intercept. Instead, it would just leave me with the 2 distance markers. And then I would bump the maneuver node, touch something, move it a minute forward or a minute backward, and the relative position of the ship and Tylo would jump hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers, which was infuriating. And now we're moving on to the final stages. It's all coronets from here on out. So I want to remind all of you, you just saw the maneuver node that I was executing. It led directly into a Tylo intercept course. There's no way of confusing what we all saw on the video here. So when I open up the map in a quick second, you're going to see something very confusing. Because when I went to check my course, I realized that I was significantly off course. And I ended up trying to burn the ship far longer to try and get us further out on course, to try and correct things, fix things. And that did not make it better. So considering the amount of fuel I had on board, and that everything up until this point had been one take, I really wanted to just commit and try and make this work somehow. I know the game bugged and I should have just reloaded here, but I'm not built like that. So instead, I decided to try and spend more fuel to get to an adjusted course that would then get us a new intercept around Tylo. And when I fired the engines this time, I could do little more than hope that it was actually going to work, and that maybe this time the maneuver node wouldn't lie to me. So I'd been burning these coronet engines for a pretty good long time at this point, and I thought I could get a little bit more boost out of dropping a little bit of the extra weight. This time around, my fuel transfers didn't actually work, but I ended up trying this on a later stage of the rocket, and it did work out just fine. I didn't have enough time this time around, predominantly because I was dealing with lit engines at the same time. So then, once I finally made it to Tylo, I attempted to get a maneuver node set that would allow me to brake around it. It wouldn't give me one. The maneuver node just kept on glitching. Navigation would not allow me to do it. So I actually ended up braking around Tylo manually. You know, no guidance, no maneuver node, no target. I just locked myself in retrograde and just fired the engines as hard as I could. So, because of the fact that I have no maneuver node, the only way that I can tell whether this is working or not is by looking at the slope of the line of my ejection from Tylo and trying to compare it from what I remember seeing previously. If the line is more arced, then I am succeeding. One of the unintended benefits to these drop tanks was they actually allowed me to do arc comparison better, because as they fell off the ship, they didn't gain any new inertia. But the ship did because the engines were still firing, so it gave me a point of comparison between the two lines to determine if this brake was actually going to work out or not. And now, the final 4 engines have lit. So, now that we have successfully orbitalized, our new goal is to bring ourselves lower in altitude and closer in inclination to our target point, which is the little yellow circle on the surface of Tylo. That is where we need to land. Before we go anywhere though, we dropped off the little satellite attachment we had on top of the main command pod. This will act not only as a booster for the main Jool satellite, which is high in orbit over Jool from a previous mission, but also will allow us to maintain more consistent signal with any of the ground surface stuff, the rover and the main command pod predominantly. With ourselves lined up, we bring ourselves closer to the maneuver node, and we burn. As you can see in the lower right corner, the computer was having a field day trying to calculate what I was doing. Considering how far I had been misled by the maneuver nodes, it was very hard for me to trust in it this time around. However, fortunately, it actually didn't lead me wrong. As I came down, I realized that Tylo isn't completely tidally locked, which means that targeting a specific point on the surface actually is going to be harder because I need to compensate for the roll of the moon. However, it's not significant enough to actually be noticeable quickly. That does, however, mean if I get in a lower altitude and closer to it, it will not move as dramatically when I use time skips. So as we were lowering our altitude again, I realized that there was just enough fuel on board to fill one, but not the other, of the drop tanks, and I decided to ditch the extra weight of half of the drop tanks. So now that I understood how quickly Tylo's rotation was, I decided to use it to my advantage. The marker was currently on the dark side of the moon, and it wouldn't be that great for landing nor for visuals. So I decided to sit a little bit in orbit and let it rotate around and get closer to my current inclination, which hopefully will get me a little bit of fuel savings. This also means that everything will be lit up for you guys, so I hope you enjoy. And if you do enjoy, be sure to hit that like button and maybe tap that subscribe button. I do KSP videos once a month every month, and I post twice a week every week. So I came up with a landing maneuver node, and I'm not gonna lie, I actually ended up with 3 attempts. The first 2 attempts did not end up landing properly. Both of them did not end up expending enough fuel, so they were too heavy and ended up going far too fast as they accelerated towards the moon. The third time, however, I ended up with a slightly different problem, as you're going to see. But I found it so comical that I couldn't help but roll with it. Pun intended. So, with the final set of drop tanks disconnected, all I had to do here was just brake. And I thought the maneuver node was doing okay, but then if you see here, I deviated really heavily from it, and I was following it precisely. So I decided to take over manual control and just try and land the entire thing manually. I should admit at this point, though, that I never successfully landed on Tylo in any of the tests. I just made sure that the math for the ship was right because it took me 5 days of testing to even get this ship design to somewhat work with KSP2's glitchiness. I was locked out of so many different features. So right as we got close to the ground, I felt really confident. Fuel was dwindling quickly, but we were losing altitude. I kept on dropping myself in altitude in an attempt to get closer, but I ended up slamming my engines into the ground. But the entire craft was resting on the rover base. So I thought I had an opportunity to do something comically ridiculous. And I tried. I tried real hard, guys. I tried everything I could, adjusting steering, adjusting braking, going faster, going slower, all sorts of stuff. And no matter what I did, this thing was not designed to be a rover. It's still really funny to look at, but it was not designed for this. And anytime we hit a hill, it just became absolutely uncontrollable until it did something whack. Every time I tried to release the rover, it would just get slammed down. I think that the science module on the back overweighed the rear end, so it ended up pitched. It's hilarious to watch again though, just not very practical. But I wasn't gonna give up here. I had a mission to complete, and Valentina has been training in the walking Olympics for years. That's what she did on Duna. She just sat in her pod practicing leg work, you know? She's never skipped leg day, and so she just did the whole 7 kilometers on her 2 feet. And once we got out, we realized that it was another monument, very similar to the previous ones, but it features a completely different being. As we came upon the monument, we did what we always do. Basic science and research. I do love that animation. We did our observation. And then we claimed it. I mean, nobody else is here. We might as well claim it as ours. A really cool looking monument too.